All right, welcome to the fifth and final session of the fall 2024 Small Ruminant Backyard Farming Series. My name is Megan Purdue. I am the Ag Agent in Worcester County, Maryland. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Livestock Guardians per request from previous groups. That was a topic that they wanted to address. And we are a university program, so we do not discriminate. All right, and always we have some disclaimers. Nothing that we present represents medical, veterinarian, or legal advice. It is not meant to replace your veterinarian. It's just the stuff that we present is to help you to work better with a veterinarian. You should always seek a competent veterinarian advice when possible. If we use a website, product, or brand, it's not an endorsement. For this one, the breeds that are in the pictures are not an endorsement. It just happens to be what's in my backyard. And if you have an emergency, it is essential to have a veterinarian that you are in a good standing with so that you can get their help as soon as needed. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is what is a livestock guardian. So these are animals that live with their livestock to protect them from predators. And generally speaking, they're going to be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Now, if something happens, the guardian is injured or needs medical care, or something happens with it, it may be taken out. But generally speaking, they're with the livestock all the time. And they do get very bonded to the livestock, and the livestock get to be dependent on them. So guardian animals are typically going to be certain breeds of dogs, donkeys, llamas, and maybe even alpacas. And we're going to talk about the different types of guardians. And I put alpacas with a question mark because if you've been around alpacas are kind of small in comparison to llamas. So they're not going to be very effective against the big predators, but they can have their uses in certain situations. So first thing is things to consider. Well, as with any kind of pest, you need to identify it first. So we all may be in different parts of the country, so our predators that we're dealing with may be different. I'm very fortunate in this part of the country that the main things that we have to deal with are neighbors' dogs and vultures. Those are the big concerns. To a lesser degree, fox may cause some problems, but generally not very much when it comes to small ruminants. Fox may be a problem when you have poultry, and they are a big problem when you have poultry. There's a lot more predators that you have to deal with. This list will get a lot longer when it comes to poultry. Some of this can be used for your backyard poultry too, but our predator list is going to be a lot more diverse. For larger livestock like small ruminants, dogs can be a problem, especially if they're running in a pack or they're strays. Even a neighbor's pet, even your own dog can become a predator if you're not careful. Coyotes are becoming more prevalent in areas that they hadn't previously been. For example, in my area, there are coyotes pretty close. And in my lifetime, this is the first time that I've ever heard of coyotes being around us, but they are within probably 20 miles of me right now, which is not very far for a coyote. So that is in my mind when, I look at my livestock is, it may just be a matter of time. In certain parts of the country, wolves are very prevalent. It may be a problem. In the feline family, we think stuff like bobcats. Fortunately, I do not have them here, but they may be in your neck of the woods. Birds can be predators. Eagles, vultures. We have I call them the black-headed vulture. I've also heard them called Mexican vultures. They're not like your standard turkey buzzard. These are very aggressive, and they will go after an animal, especially while it's giving birth. I tell people a regular turkey buzzard gives you a grieving period when an animal dies before it goes after it. These do not. The animal's not even taking its last breath, and they may go after it. They are very aggressive. They generally don't leave the area after they've found food there. You have to run them off, and they get very nasty. And we have had people in my area have problems with animals being killed by these black-headed vultures. If you don't know what you have a problem with, you can set up a wildlife camera to try to identify them and what the pressure is from those predators. So you may have a pack of coyotes, or you may have one or two coyotes. You might have a few buzzards, but not a lot of buzzards. You need to see what is visiting your farm, your pastures, and how many of them. So your location is going to be a consideration. So how big is the area that your animals are in that the guardian would have to protect? Um, a lot of dogs like to roam, so bigger fields. That's why they do really well out west. These big, ample pastures that are thousands of acres are quite a bit different than the 2 acres that might be in your backyard where you keep your sheep and goats. The type of fencing is important. So, what types of guardians will stay in the fence that you currently have, or are you going to have to put up new fence? Um, would another consideration would be, can you solve your problems by just putting up a good fence? So some predators you can keep away by just having a good fence, and you wouldn't need a guardian per se. Your neighbors are another consideration. If you have close neighbors, you need to realize that guardians are noisy, especially dogs. Dogs bark a lot, and usually it's at night when there's a lot more predators out. It might be just a car passing by, but they're going to tell you every little thing that goes on out there where they are that they don't think should be there. Donkeys do make a lot of noise as well. Alpacas make a lot of noise if there's something around, but dogs are probably going to be the one that gets you a complaint by your neighbor. So you need to also look at the money that goes into this. Trained animals are going to cost money. Can you get a good animal cheap? Absolutely, you can. My best guardian dog cost me $100, but don't count on that. You want to pay for quality. You want to pay for something that has been trained and has proven itself. You may need more than one for large pieces of property. Dogs do work very well in pairs. If you have a lot of predator pressure, you may need more than one animal. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. So one animal might not be enough. You may have to figure on 2 to 3, depending on how many animals you're trying to protect, how big the space is, what kind of predators you're dealing with. Separate housing and feeding space may be needed. So a dog's usually going to bed down with the sheep and goats. Donkey's going to need something a little bit bigger. Now, an alpaca or llama might need something a little bit bigger than what you have out there for your sheep and goats. Just depends on what you already have. Feeding space is a consideration because you might not be feeding these animals the same thing. If you're feeding dogs, you're not going to be feeding them. They might jump in your trough and eat with your sheep and goats, but they also need to have their dog food somewhere. And then there's, as we're very familiar with in all animal species, there's always veterinary care to consider. So if your dog's going to need veterinary care. With sheep and goats, depending on how you raise them, you may never need a vet. You should have one, but if you're looking at it strictly what the animal's worth, some people choose to put the animal down if it gets sick and needs a vet because the cost of the animal doesn't justify the cost of the veterinary care. Hopefully, it's not going to be the case with a guardian animal because you're going to have a significant investment into them. So you're going to have a vet. Maybe you only have a livestock vet for your livestock, but then you introduce a dog. You also have to have a small animal vet if there's ever an emergency. Your livestock vet may be willing to take care of vaccinations, but they're not going to take care of a bloat surgery. The same thing with a donkey. It's going to need a different type of veterinarian, possibly depending on who is caring for your animals. It may need an equine vet. And again, you have a livestock vet. And some of these animals can have very expensive problems. Equines can have big vet bills. Dogs can have very big vet bills. And then there's some upkeep that's going to be in addition to what you would have with your livestock. So if you have a dog, if you have a long-haired dog, it's going to need to be brushed. They do shed. So the long-haired ones, this is a picture of, looks like a Great Pyrenees that was rescued that obviously hadn't been brushed in a long time, and his hair became very matted. And I think it said 35 pounds of hair off of its body. I mean, that's a lot of weight for a dog to be carrying around. So your dogs are going to have to be brushed. Alpacas and llamas will need to be shorn once a year, which if you have sheep, that might not be a big deal if you're shearing the sheep. Sometimes your sheep shearer will go ahead and shear the alpaca or the llama too. It's a different style than traditional sheep shearing. So your sheep shearer may or may not be comfortable with it. Hoof trimming is another issue. So, you know, it's pretty easy to learn how to trim hooves on sheep and goats, and you could do it on an alpaca or a llama. But a donkey's going to be quite a bit different. You need a farrier for that. And then teeth. All of them may have teeth problems. Your dog can have teeth problems that have to be addressed. Your donkey may have to have its teeth floated, and that requires a horse dentist. Llamas and alpacas may have to have their teeth cut down because they get very long in the front. Once you decide on the animal, there is an adjustment period that you have to factor in. So even if you buy an animal that is fully trained, you pay decent money for it, it's proven itself with other animals, there's still going to be an adjustment period for that animal. And then the other adjustment period is going to be for the animals that are being protected. So your sheep, if they're not used to, your sheep or your goats, if they're not used to a dog, it's going to scare the living daylights out of them. They may try to attack it. They're going to be very stressed. So even if the dog behaves perfectly, it's still going to stress them out because they're not used to a predator being in the same pen with them. So these are things that you need to take into consideration before you just go throw a dog out there with your herd. What may work for you is a pen within the pasture. When I introduced my guardian dogs to the sheep and the goats, I put a kennel out in the pasture. I kept the dog in the kennel, and then the sheep and the goats, they had the option to move away from the animal, but they could get around, and eventually they got used to it. When I introduced them, I introduced them with the dog on a lunge line, a very long lead, so that I could shut everything down if somebody got too stressed or if somebody misbehaved. And then eventually they do catch on, and there wasn't too many problems with it. The dog behaved well. The sheep got used to it, and quit paying attention to it. And they do learn animals. So if you replace a guardian with another guardian that looks just like it, the sheep are still going to know that that's a different animal, and they may or may not trust it. We also need to keep in mind that animals are unpredictable. Even if you've done everything to the T, did everything perfectly, bad things can happen. So even if the animal is trained, it's been proven, it's done a wonderful job, they can make mistakes. I had my guardian dog one day, she decided that she wanted babies. And after the third rejected twin of my goats, I figured out that the dog was stealing the second twin. And then, of course, I guess she snapped at the mamas when she stole it, and the mamas didn't want anything to do with that baby that the dog stole. So I ended up with 3 bottle babies that I shouldn't have had that year, all because my well-trained, well-adjusted guardian dog decided she wanted her own babies. Guardians can become the predator, so that can happen with dogs. You know, dog has a bad day. I had my current guardian out with chickens, and she did wonderful with chickens. Kind of surprised me because the guardian dog before her, she was not bird friendly at all, which was fine because I wanted her to keep the vultures and the eagles away from my flock. But this guardian, she was doing very well with the chickens. She did great with them all summer. And then one day I caught her eating one. I was like, okay, it probably died and she's trying to get rid of the body. It was hot. It had been hot. Figured it had heat stroke. And then another one. And then another one. And eventually I figured out, no, she was having chicken dinner every night. So they can do well and then all of a sudden not do well. You may have seen the video on social media of the donkey picking up the goat by the back of the neck. That is something that can happen. I watched a burro that we had some years ago. She was great at chasing off the fox. It was wonderful. And then one day I walked out there and she had one of my goats by the back of the neck. And that was the last time she was ever with the goats. So they can have a bad day. They can just decide they're tired of them. And then they become the predator. So that is something you always want to keep in mind. These are animals. They don't read the book. And if they did, they skip chapters. There are also animals within the herd or the flock that may reject the guardian. So I had my sheep loved my Great Pyrenees, and I also had a Bernese Mountain Dog, and we're going to talk about why that is not a good idea out there. That was a unique situation, but I had one sheep that did not like the dogs, and she would go after the dogs. So there is that possibility as well. I mean, 12 other sheep were fine with it. One sheep decided she wanted nothing to do with them. They needed to stay out of her space, and she would try to attack them any chance she got. So the other thing that you have to have a plan for is what's going to happen if the guardian doesn't work out. So if you get a dog and it starts attacking your animals, what are you going to do with it? If you get a donkey and it starts attacking your animals, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to rehome it? Are you going to turn it into a farm pet? Or are you going to euthanize it? So that is the reality of having them, is because a lot of these guardian dogs, there are tons of certain parts of the country, there are a ton of guardian dogs in shelters, and it's a shame. Part of it is they are bred poorly, they're overbred, they've failed out of being a guardian animal, and that's a big dog to have in your home. And they don't always make the greatest house pets. But that is something you have to figure out. Now, my Great Pyrenees, the one that I have now, she flunked at being a chicken guardian, so she gets a small pasture during the summer. Right now she's in a big indoor kennel, and she just is close to the sheep, but she is not allowed out there with the sheep. So even if the dog does work out, they're eventually going to have to retire, and that's the same with any animal. Eventually they're going to get too old to do work. They might get injured, they might get a disease that causes them to have to retire early. So the thing to think about, especially you absolutely are in a situation where you need to have a guardian on your property. Do you have a younger animal trained to replace the older animal? It takes time to get a young animal trained. For dogs, it's about 2 years before they're really considered trustworthy and trained. So, in generally speaking, when you have them, you're going to let an older animal train the younger animal. Um, the age difference between those two dogs was about 8 years. And the older dog lived to be 13. She wasn't doing a whole lot by the time she reached 13 because she was slow getting around. But she tried, and her vision was getting poor, but she thought she was guarding, and I let her guard up until she died. So we've talked a good bit about livestock guardian dogs. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about livestock guardian dogs. So when you select one thing, and this creates such great debate and drama on Facebook, but you want to make a selection of livestock guardian breeds only. So if you pick a mixed breed dog, which people commonly have mixed breed guardian dogs, but the key to that is all breeds within that mix need to be livestock guardian dog breeds. Not working dog breeds. There are a lot of breeds that do extremely well on the farm, and they're considered multi-purpose, but they're not livestock guardian dogs. They might do some guarding. They might do a little bit of herding and work well around sheep and goats, but they're not livestock guardian breeds. So when we talk about livestock guardian breeds, we're talking about Great Pyrenees, Anatolian Shepherd, the Akbash, Marima. There's a handful of them that are really popular. They might be limited in your area, so you have to first look at what you have, the breeds that you have access to, and then see what's going to fit your style and your management, your flock management. You want to make sure that their parents are working stock. They're not somebody's pet that lives within the home. Sometimes people get desperate to sell puppies because these are big puppies, and by the time they reach 8 weeks old, they are pooping a lot, they are eating a lot. And these dogs can have large litters. So I have seen people that are getting a little bit desperate to get rid of their puppies, and then they start trying to market them as a livestock guardian dog. Well, the pictures that I'm seeing, these puppies are raised in the house, and they're not, or these people don't have flocks of sheep and goats for the animals to bond with. So you want to make sure that the parents are working stock, because puppies learn from their parents. These puppies are typically a good breeder is going to have these puppies raised with the stock that they will be guarding. So a lot of times the dog will whelp out in the barn. And then as soon as the puppies are up and around, they are out with the sheep and the goats or the chickens, whatever they are being raised with. And then you always the puppies need to be started with a trained adult. They will learn from the trained adult. If you plan on getting one as a puppy, I would not get a livestock guardian dog as a puppy unless you are currently own an adult livestock guardian dog that can help finish training it. Otherwise, you need to start with an adult. There are exceptions, and this is where a lot of people get on Facebook and say, but my such and such a mixed breed, or this breed of dog lives with our goats and it does great and it saves so many lives. There's always going to be exceptions. That those exceptions can go both ways. So even if the dog is the right breed, it was raised with parents that work, the breeder did everything right, they can still fail as a guardian. Just like a police dog, you can have a Belgian Malinois that was a $30,000 dog, can go into be trained as a canine and fail, and then somebody just some ordinary person adopts it as a pet. The same thing happens with guardian dogs. And then you can have some working breed dogs that have some guardian qualities, but you should not leave them with the stock without supervision. So this is I have my Great Pyrenees and my Bernese Mountain Dog. I will tell you, the Bernese Mountain Dog lived with the Great Pyrenees out with the sheep, and he did a wonderful job. He was very unique because, one, I bought him sight unseen. He was 18 months old. He had never left a kennel. He was very shy of people. So he attached himself to the Great Pyrenees. She did all the work. He just was her backup. So when she was sound asleep, because sometimes guardian breeds will split shifts, and what these two did was they split shifts. So she was awake all night and he was awake part of the night, but during the day she was sound asleep and he was sitting up on alert, ready. And if he barked, she got up and she investigated it, but he was there as kind of a lookout. He did a good job where he was, but he was not. If something had attacked, I don't know that he would have done anything. He was there just as her companion and give her some break, like the substitute teacher. He's not going to teach anybody, but he's going to let you know if there's problems and make sure nothing gets out of hand. So I do not advocate for putting just an ordinary working breed out with your stock as a guardian animal. If you choose to do that, you do that knowing the risk that you take. So just be aware of that. So with training on livestock guardian breeds, the bonding starts very early. It starts at 4 to 16 weeks. So like by 4 weeks of age, those puppies should be out and in with the stock so they can start that bonding process. At 4 weeks old, they should most certainly be with their parents, especially with their mom, because they're still going to be nursing. They'll probably be eating a little bit, but they're still going to be nursing. And generally, a good breeder is going to keep the puppies until they're at least 12 to 16 weeks to help ensure that bonding. They have to learn fences and boundaries. That puppy in there had a really hard time with the fence. Bless her heart, she got shocked so many times. And maybe that's what was wrong with her. But she just could not get the fence. I think she was from there was a family that they did everything pretty good, but there was a lot of kids, and I think she had a lot of human interaction while she was younger. So she wanted to be with me. She loved being out there with the animals, but she also really wanted to be with me. And that caused her to get shocked several times while we were fence training. Your puppy should learn the basic commands. So there's a couple of reasons for that. They're not going to go to a dog show. And there actually is a meme that I've seen on social media. It has a picture of a Great Pyrenees standing still and all the different commands. And it's just showing how stubborn Great Pyrenees are when it comes to obedience training. But you want to be able to stop bad behavior. So if your dog starts chasing your livestock, it needs to know the command for no so that you can stop it from doing that before something happens. You're going to have to groom these animals. Even if you hardly ever touch them, you're still going to have them friendly enough and behave well enough that you can groom them. At a minimum, even if you get a short-haired dog, a lot of times they leave the dew claws, the rear dew claws on these dogs. And a lot of them have the double dew claw. A dew claw, because they're not using it and it's not touching the surface, if they're not trimmed probably at least once a year, they will wrap around and grow into the pad. So you're going to have to make sure you keep an eye on the dew claws. Even if you have a short-haired dog, there's still going to be a minimal amount of grooming involved. And then there's going to be some veterinary care. They have to be vaccinated against rabies. It's the law, at least in most states, you have to do it. It has to be done by a veterinarian. But also these animals are more likely to be exposed to rabies than the average dog would. So you want to get their puppy vaccinations, you want to get their adult vaccinations, and you also want to make sure they're up to date on rabies. And then if something were to happen with them, like one they got attacked by, they actually had to fight a predator and they were left with wounds, or they got attacked, then you need to be able to get them safely to a vet and get them cared for. And then you're going to be in and out around your livestock. Your children may be in and around them. So you want to make sure that these animals are safe around both the livestock and the people. And I have tagged a fact sheet for that one. I have a couple of fact sheets in the notes that provide some information about livestock guardian animals. So some of the challenges with the livestock guardian dogs is feeding is going to be a challenge. You're going to need to feed them separate from your other livestock. So you're going to have to put up some sort of system where the dog can get into it to eat and the sheep and goats can't, or you're going to have to feed them with you there. Odds are they're going to eat the grain and the minerals, and overeating some things can be dangerous to them. So if that's a situation on your farm, then you may want to consult with your veterinarian to see if there's anything that you should limit or not allow your animals to get. They tend to roam. So if you do not have good fences, if you're on a smaller piece of property, you do not have good fences, your dog may get out and go visit your neighbors, and that's not necessarily a good thing. Unlike most livestock, we technically neuter a lot of males, but you're probably going to want to get your dog spayed or neutered. That's not a cheap surgery, especially for a large breed animal. But that is something you need to factor in, especially if you're getting a puppy. There's going to be some downtime where you don't have them there because they're recovering from that surgery. And they do dig a lot. So that can be which means they can dig out of pens. They can also dig nice holes in the middle of your pasture, which can be a problem for large livestock or your equipment. They do have a prey drive, so that can get them into trouble with attacking your livestock. And like I said earlier about mine, they can steal lambs and kids. And hopefully they're not stealing them to hurt them, but that does cause you to have some bottle babies when mom won't take them back. There's some liability. So if the animal does get loose, you could be found guilty of the leash laws. We have leash laws in my area, and if there's a dog at large, I could be fined for that if it's my dog. Your neighbor, if it goes visits your neighbor and attacks your neighbor's dog, you might, we talked a little bit about this last week, you might not get in trouble, but you also may have vet bills that you have to pay for the other dog. And there's also, if you're close to a road, your dog could get hit by a car, which can, if your dog's, I worked at an emergency vet clinic, and I watched cops follow owners to the clinic to cite them because they had a dog at large. It is a liability. So you want to make sure that you have good fences and you keep them in. And like I mentioned earlier, barking is a big challenge, especially if you have neighbors close by. They might not appreciate that and call the law on you or complain about it. So, and it might keep you up. They are very loud, is what they're supposed to do. But if you're on a smaller piece of property, you're going to hear barking all night, most likely. There are a lot of benefits to livestock guardian dogs in particular. One, they're not going to share most diseases with livestock, especially parasites are a big problem. They're not going to share. You don't have to worry about that. They can offer some property protection because they can be intimidating to someone who is coming on, who shouldn't be on your property, but is coming on, or somebody's lurking around. Most of them don't want to encounter a big dog. They can be effective against most any predators if you have the right number of livestock guardian dogs, but they are also effective against the bird type predators like vultures, which other guardian animals might not be. They're a good cleanup crew. So they, if you have mamas giving birth, they're going to go out there and they're going to clean up. They're going to lick up most of the birthing fluids. They're going to clean up the afterbirth. It's all to deter scavengers. So their instinct tells them to clean anything up so that it doesn't draw in any predators. That dog there, she alerted me one night to a down lamb. So what I had a sheep go into labor. I thought she only had one lamb. She seemed to be done. And so I had actually gone to the vet's office. And when I came back, I went in the house first. I always checked on them during lambing and kidding right before I went to bed, but it was probably around 9 o'clock. So I usually checked around them closer to 11. And I heard her up next to the house just barking. And I knew the type of bark it was I needed to go check something out. So I went out there and she took me to a dead lamb. And I'm like, okay, well, that one's dead. But apparently his mama had more than one. And then she took me over to another one, and that one was alive. So I scooped up the live one because it was half frozen and brought it in the house. Well, when I went back out there to take the dead one out, she had decided to start cleaning it up. So I guess she saw, once I verified that it was dead, she showed me what it was, which was great instinct on her part. That way I knew that she didn't kill it. But then she was going to take care of the body. And I was like, well, we're not doing that. So I took it away from her and put it on the compost pile. But they do alert you to other problems other than predators. So, if you have an animal that gets its head stuck in the fence, they might alert and it's screaming and you don't hear it. The dog might alert you to it. And then like kids and lambs, anything that's going on that shouldn't be, sometimes a good guardian dog will let you know. So the next one we're going to talk about is probably falls second in line to dogs. Dogs usually seem to be the most popular, but donkeys. So again, with donkeys, when you're going to get a donkey, you want to make sure you have one you get one that's already been working. You want to make sure that they are aggressive towards canines. So you want to make sure that they have that guardian instinct. You want one that's not bonded to other equines, because what happens when a donkey fails is because it's hanging out with the other horses or the other donkeys and not hanging out with the sheep and the goats. You want them to be people friendly. Again, you're going to have to do work with these animals. You may have to move them. You may have to halter them, lead them around, give them veterinary care. So they do need to be friendly. Some of the challenges with donkeys is they can become aggressive and attack livestock. Once they decide they've had enough of that goat, they can attack it, and it doesn't take much for them to kill something. They bite and kick. That's both dangerous for people and animals. They may attack pets, and that is something that you have to be very careful with any livestock guardian animal, is taking your pets near the other animals, because what they're going to do is they're going to see your pets. In many cases, they're going to see your pets as the predator. Now, my livestock guardian dogs, sometimes they will allow certain dogs near the animals, and there were other dogs that they absolutely hated. And from my personal experience, knowing the dogs, they let the dogs near the animals that were safe around the animals, and they hated the ones that would have attacked the animals. The few dogs that my first Great Pyrenees hated had a poor history around livestock. So I knew her instincts were good. Donkeys are going to be more effective against canine type predators. They can become more concerned with other equines. So if your neighbor has a bunch of horses, they might decide that they really want to be with the other horses and not with the sheep and the goats. Some medicated feeds that you may be feeding your sheep and goats are toxic to them. So that is something you want to check out if you're feeding medicated feeds. And then if they're eating too much, if they eat with the sheep and the goats, but they're getting too much, that can become a problem for them as well. And they tend to get fat too. So these are not, when you have a donkey in there as a guardian animal, you're probably not breeding it, and they can become very low maintenance. So you may have to be careful how much feed they're having access to. And then veterinary emergencies, like I said earlier, they can become very expensive for equines. So if it colics or it becomes lame, that's going to be a very expensive veterinary emergency. A broken leg is probably going to be the end of its career. So these are some of the things to consider before. And equine vets tend to be more costly than a general farm vet. So these are things that you need to consider when you're making these choices. Some of the benefits is they live a long time. So you may only ever need that one donkey. Dogs, if you get it at 2 years old, you might get 8 to 10 years with it. A donkey may be already well trained and you get 30 years with it. You get it at 20 and you might still get another 30 years with it. They eat most of the same diet as sheep and goats. So they're going to be grazing, they're going to eat hay. They may even be able to eat the same grain, just depending on what you're feeding them. The fencing is another advantage. Donkeys should require less fencing than sheep and goats. So if it's built for sheep and goats, it should certainly hold a donkey. They do not share parasites with small ruminants. So you're getting that multi-species grazing advantage with donkeys. And they alert with loud braying. So if you've never heard a donkey bray, most of you have probably heard a donkey bray, but it is very loud and obnoxious. And so you shouldn't miss it. So llamas and alpacas. So again, the selection, preferably something that's already trained. And that should be a consistent trend for all livestock guardian animals, is something that you start with something that's already trained. You learn what to do. And then once you know what to do, then you could then get something that's not trained and work to train it with your already trained animals. They tend to be more aggressive towards canine type predators. You want something that's healthy. You want to make sure you're starting off with something healthy. You probably don't want something that comes out of the sale barn. Make sure that it's not loaded down with parasites. Probably want to check under that fleece to make sure there's nothing surprising you're gonna find when you go to shear it down the first time. They need to be able to be handled. So you got to handle these guys at least once a year to shear them down. You can't let some alpacas, you can get by if they have a thin coat with once every 2 years and you're not in an extremely hot environment, but they really need to be sheared at least once a year. They need to have their teeth checked and their hooves trimmed at that same time. Their hooves don't grow like a sheep and a goat, so usually you can get away with once a year. And usually then they're only trimming a little bit off, but those need to be checked every year. Another thing with them is the meningeal worm. They need to have a preventative deworming, usually with ivermectin, once a month. If you have white-tailed deer anywhere near them, and you're in a mild climate, you're going to have to do some sort of meningeal worm preventative treatment on them, which usually requires an injectable ivermectin, which means you're going to have to get your hands on them pretty regularly, at least during the warm months. The challenges with them, in addition to the meningeal worm, would be they can bite, kick, spit, and stomp. And none of those are pleasant. They're they've got ammunition on all ends. These can too also attack pets. My alpaca, I can't take my Shelties anywhere near her. She thinks they're fox. She will go after them. At the same time, the smaller ones, especially alpacas, can be intimidated by larger predators. So my alpacas wanted nothing to do with my livestock guardian dogs. They knew she was a dog, but you could tell when they saw her size, they're like, oh no, we're not doing that. They have good survival instincts and they know they're out of their league with a large animal. For that reason, your alpacas may be too small for some predators. And again, you have to make sure you shear them every year. Some of the benefits for alpacas is they tend to live longer lives. Their lifespan is about 20 years. So, if you're figured on retiring out of the sheep and goat world within 20 years, then they might last that entire time. They can eat most of the same diet because they are considered small ruminants themselves. The fencing should be compatible with sheep and goats. And they can be on the same deworming program as sheep and goats. We use the FAMACHA for llamas and alpacas the same way that we do sheep and goats. Now, like I said before, though, the meningeal worm can be an issue. So that's something, they're very sensitive to that. So that's something to keep in mind. And they will usually alert when they see predators. So you'll hear this high, shrill, kind of like a hyena laugh coming from them when they see something suspicious. And that could be the neighbor's dog in the neighbor's yard, but they will let you know. Usually you hear it, you look to see where they're looking, and you can figure out what's going on. So in conclusion, when you're looking at all this, hopefully everything that I've told you has inspired you to do your homework. Um, I did not cover every single thing because each animal would be an entire presentation by itself. What I want you to do is I want to give you enough information to make an informed decision. You got to look at your cost and risk. Um, is it worth putting the investment into a guardian animal, or do I need to just put up better fencing to protect them against the predators that I have? So you need to know what type of predators you have and then decide what type of guardians would work best. You want to make sure that it's compatible with your management. So if you're not willing to go out there every day and feed the dogs separately, then that might not be the guardian animal for you. If you don't want to fix your fences, then a dog might be out of the question. If you don't want to have better fences, then a dog might not work out. Now there is an option if you are worried about safety. You could have guardian animals in a perimeter fence and your other animals in the interior. But whatever you decide to do, you need to make sure that you train the animals and you monitor them closely, and always have a backup plan if things go south. So if your guardian animal turns out to not be a good guardian animal, then what are you going to do? Can you handle it if your guardian animal attacks your goat or your sheep? Can you handle it if it goes bad? Can you handle it if your guardian animal does their job and gets killed or gets attacked and bloodied up? Is that something you are going to be able to handle both financially and emotionally and physically? Because that animal, if it lives through, it's going to need veterinary care. You're going to need to be able to get it to the vet. So these are things to think about when you're trying, because sometimes, I've seen guardian animals, they do exactly what they're supposed to do, and they get some pretty nasty wounds, or they do get killed because but that is what they're there for. And that is, if that's not something that you can handle, then you might want to look at other options like better fencing, keeping the animals up, putting the animals up at night, keeping them closer to the barn, things like that. All right. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll take a look at them.